Back at it today with another video, as today we're going to be taking a look at every team's worst player. Now real quick, a couple things I want to go over before we get into the video. Number one, I'm strictly basing my picks off of 2022 numbers. Number two, some of these players are currently free agents, but like I just said, I'm basing this off of 2022, so I'm going off of who they played for last year. Also, if you're not too happy with who I picked for your team, and you don't think they're a bad player, that's a good thing. That means your team doesn't necessarily have many bad players. But anyways, with that in mind, let's get right into this. Getting things started off with the Baltimore Orioles, I have Robinson Chirinos. Chirinos this past season posted a negative 1.6 WAR in 67 games where he also hit 179. He's been a much better player throughout his career, but as he gets up there in age, he has fallen off quite a bit. Getting on to the Boston Red Sox, I have Hansel Robles. Robles this past season in 25 innings posted a 5.84 ERA to go along with a negative 0.7 WAR. Similar to Chirinos, Robles has been much better throughout his career, but he is getting up there in age at this point, and he is definitely past his prime and not a very good player. Getting on to the Toronto Blue Jays, I have Cavan Biggio. Biggio this past season in 97 games hit .202 to go along with 6 home runs. As a prospect, he was supposed to be a really good player, and he's really just been a huge letdown up to this point in his career. Moving on to the Tampa Bay Rays, I have Luis Patino. This past season, he only pitched in 20 innings where he had an 8.1 ERA. I don't like putting Patino on this list because he's still so young and has dealt with numerous injuries so far, so I don't think he deserves a lot of hate, but he is Tampa Bay's worst player right now. Next up, we have the New York Yankees, where I'm going with Aroldis Chapman. Chapman this past season in 36 innings posted a 4.46 ERA. At first glance, those numbers don't necessarily look awful, but he had a huge collapse down the stretch, and I think he is honestly washed at this point. Getting on to the Kansas City Royals, I have Hunter Dozier. Dozier in 128 games this past season posted a negative 1.4 WAR. He's another player who has shown some promise earlier on in his career, and I do still think he has a lot of potential to be a pretty decent player, but this past season he was really bad. Next up, we have the Detroit Tigers, where I'm going with Miguel Cabrera. This one really breaks my heart, but it's the sad truth. Cabrera is a shell of what he once was. He's a first ballot Hall of Famer, but at this point he's not a good player. Getting on to the Cleveland Guardians, I have Austin Hedges. Hedges in 105 games posted a 163 average to go along with a 489 OPS. He's a really bad player, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him out of the big leagues in the next couple years. Moving on to the Chicago White Sox, I have Leury Garcia. Garcia this past season in 97 games hit .210 to go along with a 500 OPS. Now Garcia is not necessarily an awful player because he is a utility man. He can play lots of different positions, and that is pretty valuable in today's game. Next up, we have the Minnesota Twins, where I'm going with Miguel Sano. Sano this past season only played in 20 games where he hit .83 to go along with a 345 OPS. Very small sample size, I know, but in that small sample size, he was one of the worst players in all of baseball. Next up is the Houston Astros, where I'm going with Yuli Gurriel. Last year, Gurriel played in 146 games in which he hit .242 to go along with 8 home runs and a negative 0.3 WAR. He's definitely not your prototypical worst player on a baseball team. He's not really bad, but he was pretty bad this past season. Moving on to the Seattle Mariners, I have Abraham Toro. Last year, Toro played in 109 games in which he hit .185 to go along with a negative 0.8 WAR. He's similar to Leury Garcia in the sense that he's a utility man, so he has some sort of value attached to him, but he's still not a very good player. Next up, we have the Oakland A's, where I'm going with Christian Pache. Pache this past season played in 91 games where he hit .166 to go along with a 459 OPS. I hate to say it, but Pache might be the single worst player in baseball today. He was a former prospect who was traded from the Braves, and I would have loved to see him blossom into a good player, but he's just not good at all. Getting on to the Los Angeles Angels, I have Jared Walsh. Now this is a weird one because the Angels, as bad as a team as they are, they don't necessarily have any really bad players. So that explains why Walsh, who isn't really a bad player, is the worst player on the Angels. Last year he only hit .218 and had a negative 0.7 WAR, but he's a much better player than that as he made the All-Star team in 2021. Next up is the Texas Rangers, where I have Cole Calhoun. Calhoun this past season in 125 games hit .196 to go along with a 587 OPS. Back in his Angel days, he was a pretty solid player, but at this point in his career, he is not a good player at all. Moving on to the Miami Marlins, I have Elieser Hernandez. Hernandez this past season in 62 innings posted a 6.35 ERA. He has shown potential earlier on in his career, and I still think he has potential to be a solid pitcher, but last year he was really bad. Moving on to the New York Mets, I have Dominic Smith. Last year in 58 games, Smith hit .194 to go along with a negative .4 WAR. He had some hype coming up through the minor leagues, and ever since he's never really lived up to it, and last year was no different. He was not a good player. Next up is the Washington Nationals, where I'm going with Nelson Cruz. Cruz this past season played in 124 games where he hit .234 to go along with 10 home runs. Now this is a really weird one because the Nationals are the worst team in baseball, but Cruz isn't really awful at this point. He's definitely not a good player, but he's better than a lot of players we're going to be mentioning in today's video. Next up is the Atlanta Braves, where I have Eddie Rosario. Rosario last year in 80 games hit .212 to go along with a negative 1.6 WAR. He's all around one of the worst players in baseball today, and it's crazy to say that because he was, just a couple years ago, a really big piece to the Braves' 21 World Series championship. Moving on to the Philadelphia Phillies, I have Nick Castellanos. This one I hate to do, but it just shows how good of a team the Phillies are right now. Castellanos last year in 136 games hit .263 to go along with 13 bombs. He's not an awful player, but he was definitely a huge letdown in his first year in Philadelphia, but I have no doubt in my mind he's going to play much better going forward. Getting on to the St. Louis Cardinals, I have Andrew Knizner. Knizner last year played in 96 games in which he hit .215 to go along with 4 home runs. He's another player who's not awful. In fact, I think he's one of the better players on today's list, but when looking at the rest of the Cardinals roster, I think he is the worst. Next up, we have the Milwaukee Brewers, where I'm going with Jason Alexander. Alexander last year in his first big league season in 72 innings posted a 5.4 ERA. To be completely honest, I don't really know too much about Alexander, but I do know he was pretty bad last year. Moving on to the Pittsburgh Pirates, I have Michael Chavis. Chavis last year in 129 games hit .229 to go along with a negative .2 WAR. Chavis is the type of player who can hit for some pop, but really isn't going to do anything else for you. Moving on to the Chicago Cubs, I have Alfonso Rivas. Rivas last year in 101 games hit .235 to go along with 3 home runs. He's not necessarily an awful player. The Cubs don't have too many bad players, but I do think he is the worst player on the Cubs roster. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Reds, where I'm going with Joey Votto. This is another one that just really breaks my heart. He reminds me a lot of Miguel Cabrera. He's a first ballot Hall of Famer, but he is just not what he once was. Getting on to the Arizona Diamondbacks, I have Ian Kennedy. Kennedy last year was not effective, as in 50 innings he posted a 5.36 ERA. He used to be a really good pitcher. In fact, I believe many years back he had a 20-win season where he almost won the Cy Young Award, so he used to be really good, but at this point he's probably close to retirement. Moving on to the Los Angeles Dodgers, I have Jason Hayward. Hayward last year with the Cubs hit only .204 to go along with a negative .7 WAR in 48 games. Yet another player on today's list that used to be a really good player and a former top prospect, but at this point he's not what he once was. Getting on to the Colorado Rockies, I have Elias Diaz. Diaz last year in 105 games hit .228 to go along with 9 home runs. Diaz isn't really an awful player, but he's definitely not good. He did post a pretty solid season behind the plate in 2021 where he had some good pops, so he's an okay player that has potential, but last year he was really bad. Getting on to the San Francisco Giants, I have Tommy La Stella. La Stella last year in 60 games hit only .239 to go along with a negative .7 WAR. He still does have some value, however, as he can play numerous positions, so that's valuable across the league today. Any team can use a utility guy, but he's just not a good player. And finally, getting on to the San Diego Padres, I have Craig Stammen. Stammen last year in 41 innings posted a 4.43 ERA. This is another instance here where the Padres don't necessarily have a god-awful player, but Stammen definitely wasn't effective for the Padres last season. Alright, so that's going to wrap today's video up. Let me know what you guys think down below.